Hey Kings, welcome back to the Augustus Maximus channel and the World of Hearthstone 4. Now today we'll be playing as Democratic Spain, so we'll be doing the Republican Spain focus tree path, or just path in general, which is, well, a little bit lackluster when it comes to the spicy stuff, with indirect comparison to the nationalist side, obviously. But the Republican side, as in the Democratic side, should serve in theory as the direct equivalent of the Franco path when it comes to flexibility, the various paths you can take, and so on and so forth. Well, unfortunately it doesn't, because to do a lot of stuff with the Republican side, the Democratic side, you should become the puppet of the Soviet Union. Unfortunately, or fortunately, more rather, that's not what we're going to be doing today, because being a puppet of the Soviet Union isn't something that you have to do. In fact, you have to go out of your way to become the puppet of the Soviet Union, because the Republican side, while historically and even within the game itself, they tend to lose quite often. Actually, they do have quite a decent amount of power when fighting the Civil War. It all depends on if you know what you're doing, and the AI usually doesn't know what it's doing. And the Francoist path just has well, more political power, more industry, more manpower, better divisions, everything like that, right off the get-go, right? So even before the war begins, the Francoists usually just win because they are able to take more decisions, more important decisions, and they can take more territory. Whereas with the Democratic side, the AI usually just flails about and does things randomly, not preserving its political power, and not doing its focuses correctly, and not delaying the war further, and then they just lose. And that's brilliant, right? That's exactly what the AI does. And honestly, it's a good thing from a historical perspective if you're trying to make the AI do things naturally. But from a gameplay perspective, if you're actually playing as Republican Spain, it's quite easy to just, do things correctly and end up on the winning side. It's not actually all that terrible. This is actually one of the most interesting decisions at the beginning of the game, because you can either have more divisions pop up, but they're a little bit weaker, or you can have fewer divisions, but they are a little bit more powerful. So it's a little bit, 50-50. Which one do you want? Do you sort of expect the Soviet Union to come in early and support you, meaning you can just hold the front with your trashier divisions, or do you actually want to push and regain territory quickly with your better divisions? It's actually quite an interesting conundrum right at the beginning of the focus tree. But here we go. At the beginning of the game, or at the beginning of this power struggle for the inevitable civil war, essentially what you really want to do at the beginning is just do the concessions to the left really often, because it gives you political power. And yes, it tanks quite a lot of stuff, like production and just factory building speed and everything like that, but you get more political power, which is ultimately how you can grab various territories, etc., etc. And the Francoist path AI just does the regular stuff. They take some territories, they try to hasten the civil war with various decisions. It's not actually that strange. But within the spectrum, or within the sphere of the Republican side, all you have to do is just sit here and do a whole bunch of leftist decisions. They don't actually do anything but give you political power, so it's a little bit discouraging at beginning. It can drag on quite a while, because that's ultimately what you want as Republican Spain. You want these concessions to the left to hit as often as possible, because that gives you time, it gives you political power. And similar to, for example, France, as Republican Spain, all you really need is time. Well, the Republican Spain, more specifically the Democratic side, needs a whole lot of stuff, not just time, but ultimately, at beginning, during this power struggle, all you can do is just wait. Okay, here we go. Here's the Civil War, and we're gonna go with the Democratic path. Obviously, gonna maintain the Republic. And as you can see, once you actually do a whole bunch of those concessions to the left, and you feel like it's good enough, you should start taking those territories back. And splitting off the nationalists in half is actually quite powerful, because then obviously they need to either just focus on one front entirely, which, weakens them and gives you basically free territory, or they have to transport their divisions by sea. Another very powerful thing you can do as the Republicans is actually hold these northern territories, because there you go. I guess this girl is good enough. The northern territories are actually quite powerful to just hold and keep within your grasp, because the nationalists do need these northern territories to actually unify the Carlist movement and the Phalange. And if you just hold them, then they can't unify, and they don't get a lot of industry. They don't get rid of the Carlist modifiers, and even they can even throw themselves essentially into a civil war or an additional civil war within the nationalist side between the Phalange and the Carlists, where the Carlists rise up. And ultimately, it's not quite the Phalange, but it's a civil war between nationalist Spain and the Carlist Spain, which is obviously it's quite beneficial for that to happen if you're playing as the Republicans, because the anarchists are going to rise up. They're just going to rise up, and there's nothing you can really do about that. You can delay it a little bit, but like 100 days or something. But ultimately, they are going to rise up. So it's in your best interest to essentially wrap up the conflict with the nationalists as soon as possible, or at least try to weaken them as much as possible before the anarchists rise up, because that's going to be an additional headache for you. One interesting thing when you're playing as the Republicans is that you do actually gain access to a whole lot of essentially Stalinist generals, even without doing the Stalinist path, which is actually quite interesting, because a lot of those generals are basically your best generals. I'm going to try and stick to the sort of democratic generals this time, but it doesn't actually matter, and the Stalinist generals aren't that terrible. Ultimately, when it matters is if you're going down the Resist Stalinism, I think, was the or Resist the KGB, or whatever was the name of that focus tree path, where instead of the anarchists you rise up as sort of independent communists, while the Republicans do their whole, puppeted by the Soviet Union shtick and everything like that, which again is a really interesting focus tree, and the Republican side does have a lot of interesting focus trees. It's just unfortunate the one that we were playing today isn't actually all that interesting, and we'll get into it in a little bit. But yeah, the democratic side really isn't all that great when it comes to actual payoff for going down the democratic path in comparison to, for example, the nationalist side, or the Francoist side, more rather, because the Republican, the democratic side, obviously should serve as a direct equivalent to the Francoist path, right? It's sort of the conflict was between like the nationalist side, later, halfway through led by Franco, and the Democrats, who got some support from the Soviets. And obviously then the anarchists, and then you have the whole, tension within the nationalist movement, everything like that, between sort of the junta and stuff like that. It's a whole lot of fun within Spain, obviously, during this period of time. But so the Republicans should serve, when it comes to flexibility, when it comes to sort of doing interesting things with your focus tree, it should serve as a direct equivalent to the Francoists. Unfortunately, it doesn't. It doesn't. It's actually quite terrible. A lot of people like to meme, for example, communist Hungary, which we played last time. They like to meme a lot of countries that have supposedly terrible focus trees. Well, one focus tree that's really terrible is the democratic Spain focus tree, if you don't do the puppeted by the Soviet Union. And why would you do the puppeted by the Soviet Union? The only thing it actually does is just weaken you at the beginning, and it potentially could pull you into a war against the Axis when you're not ready. It could pull you into a war against Finland and everything like that, which ultimately doesn't matter that much in the grand scheme of things, but it does mean that your stability and war support are going to tank, your industry is going to tank. And speaking of stability and war support, our stability is just trashed right now. It's completely shattered, which means that we're going to have less political power, going to have less industry, going to have less of everything, but at least the war support's quite high, which is ultimately good. But yeah, so it all depends on how you actually decide to play within the Republican path. You can make the individual countries, or I suppose uprisings, really powerful, or you can make them kind of weak. So it depends on what you're trying to do, and what you want to do, and how quickly you want to do these things, and everything like that. Because it's completely legitimate, I think, to just, when it comes to the power struggle, for Spain before the Civil War to just sit on your hands and continuously do the concessions to the left, because that means that you're going to have a lot of political power during the Civil War, so you can take all your generals, all your advisors, everything like that right off the bat, and then you're going to have a lot of power when it comes to stats during the Civil War. But it's also viable to just right off the bat try to, struggle for the territory. But it means that you're not gonna have anything else, and your army is gonna be kind of trashy because you need to do all the decisions, the concessions to the left. You have to delay the Civil War so you don't get all the debuffs from disbanding the army. Well, you're gonna get them anyway, but you're gonna get the debuffs and the nationalists don't. That's one of the big powers of the nationalist path, is that the Republicans just start right off the bat with army debuff, a giant army debuff, and you actually get a lot of buffs once you integrate the Carlists. That's sort of the balancing factor, the Carlists. But it's definitely not as big of a debuff as what the Republicans get. But ultimately, this civil war should be over swiftly. We're already managing to hold these northern territories quite well, and if we don't hold them, it doesn't actually matter, because it means that the Francoists have to do a lot of work to actually get the Carlists on side, and they tend not to be able to do it because the AI just takes ridiculously strange focuses, and that's ultimately what's gonna win us this war. And there we go. As you can see, we're completely annihilating them. We're about to win this whole thing, and the dividing of the fronts, or the dividing of the territories that the nationalists have access to, is actually a really big thing, because they can't reinforce each other. And they have to have a quite substantially longer front line than they can handle. And that's a big lag. So I guess the nationalists are rising up, or they should be rising up here any moment. Not the nationalists, the Carlists. The nationalists have risen up a long time ago. But I think the Carlists should be rising up here really soon, and we have to defeat essentially the nationalists before the anarchists rise up, because, well, we don't have to, we're gonna win anyway, but it's gonna make this whole thing quite a bit shorter and quite a bit easier to handle, actually, because there's the gold reserve. We can do that, but I don't think we will, because the gold reserves, them being transferred, ultimately does nothing to. It could potentially, there you go, the Carlists actually have risen up. Okay, they've risen up in a very small amount of territory right over there, but yeah, that's not gonna help them at all. We're just gonna smash them. If anything, it's actually gonna hasten the defeat of the nationalists by a little bit, because, well, they don't actually have access to those cities anymore, which means that they're basically losing everything like that. This civil war can drag on for quite a while, but we actually made some very swift progress here. Ultimately, because we made the right decisions before the civil war. That's the most important period of time for the civil war, is directly before the civil war. What you do and everything like that for the nationalists and for the Francoists and for the Democrats, or for the Stalinists, essentially. And for the Carlists, it's a little bit different. Same for the anarchists. There we go. The nationalists defeated. Now we have to smash the Carlists and then the anarchists, and we're gonna have a little bit of peace, which is ultimately what we want, because we need to rebuild, and we need to rebuild very swiftly. There we go. Carlists are done, and the anarchists should be popping up here quite soon. But, so yeah, before the war is, the period of time before the war, or sort of this struggle for dominance over Spain, is very important for the Francoists, for the Phalangists, definitely, for the Stalinists, or just regular communists, and for the Democrats. But after the Civil War, or during the Civil War more rather, is the most important time for the Carlists, the anarchists, and the independent communists, because, well, they can't necessarily rise up right off the bat, right? So it's a little bit strange how the entire Civil War works out, because there's a lot of complexity involved when it comes to taking the right decisions, taking control of the right states, doing the right focuses at the right time, and within the right period of time. It's quite difficult. There's a lot of stuff involved within this conflict, and for it to have such an impact on the course of your country or course of your entire playthrough right off the bat is what makes Spain quite interesting. But ultimately, the democratic Spain isn't actually all that interesting. But here we go, we're gonna crush the anarchists, crush the revolution, which is, yeah, actually, it makes sense that they would see it as a revolution. I mean, nationalist Spain ultimately won within the historical sense of things, but it was an uprising, so there we go. It's, and that's actually why within Waking the Tiger, when that DLC was relevant, when they first introduced sort of the, I think it was Waking the Tiger, when they introduced the stability and war support. Yeah, I'm pretty sure. And what happened was that the Francoists were the one to declare war, essentially nationalists. There we go, anarchist uprising. That's actually a lot of stuff that they've taken, which is quite annoying because now we have to reconquer it all back, and that's not gonna be fun. But the anarchists, it's actually quite interesting. The anarchists don't start nearly as powerful as, for example, when the Carlists take a lot of their stuff. Because the Carlists have some good generals, good armies, and what the anarchists have are good modifiers, good advisors. They have like infantry genius, army recovery genius, and everything like that. So if you can rise up as the anarchists and hold your territory, just defend essentially, and try to sort of stay relevant as long as possible, you can do quite a lot of stuff with your just advisors and modifiers that you get. But when it comes to the immediate impact of your uprising, it's actually not all that much. But yeah, ultimately we're just gonna crush him right here, and that's going to be that. But what I was talking about about Waking the Tiger when it comes to the Francoist path is a little bit irrelevant now from a certain standpoint, but I think it points to an interesting game design decision from Paradox, because the stability and war support thing really hurt the nationalist Spain because they were one to declare the war, meaning they had less stability and less war support, whereas the Republicans had more war support, especially, and more stability because they were not more stability, but more war support because they were in a defensive war, meaning they had more attack and defense on core territory, meaning they won roughly 90% of the time back in Waking the Tiger. It's kind of interesting from a game design perspective how these little small changes can actually impact the entire game, the entire playthrough, even from a historical perspective, quite often. And it's yeah, it's just kind of interesting, but not necessarily relevant to the current state of affairs, I suppose. Okay, so I skipped over quite a bit, as you can see by the state of Europe and France, the absolute state of France in 1941. But yeah, I skipped over quite a lot of stuff, and that's one thing that you're gonna have to become accustomed to if you're trying to play Democratic Spain, is that a lot of times nothing is actually going on within your country, and you can't necessarily do anything about it because you're democratic, which is, in some sense, it can be a very interesting playthrough if you're playing democratic, and for certain countries with some certain focus trees, it can become really fun to play democratic. For example, Germany, or the Churchill path with Britain, or sort of a more interventionist United States. A lot of stuff can be actually really interesting when you're democratic. But with Spain, no, actually, because the focus tree is too linear, and it gives you very random bonuses. If you just take a look at the tree of democratic Spain, all it gives you really is a few factories, a few bonuses, and a war goal against the Germans. But if you try and go with the Soviets right there, you have to subvert the Soviet control, and you can actually have a bit of fun. But if you're playing for pure Democrat, you actually have to go to war to get some of the better focuses, and to get rid of your sort of ailing economic status. But you can't actually get rid of recovering from the Civil War by just going down the natural path. Whereas if you go down the Soviet side and the Soviet subversion side and everything like that, you can get rid of the recovery from the Civil War quite quickly. Similar to Franco. Franco can get rid of the Franco can get rid of the debuffs from the Civil War, the economic debuffs, within like a span of a year, because all he has to do is do autarky, then 2 or 3 focuses, and then he gets rid of it. That's it. You know, that's the Franco's solution. You just do everything within the span of a year and you're gold and you're done. Then you can take over French North Africa, then you can do insane bonuses, you can join the Allies, you can do everything. Whereas with the democratic path, you do a metric ton of focuses because they're linear, and you have to, for example, take the naval bonus to actually get rid of some of your economic debuffs, even though you're not planning to do navy stuff at all, and it's sort of irrational for you to plan to do naval stuff if you're democratic. You're right on the border with the Germans, and so yeah, so we're gonna just go to war with the Germans, I think, because it's the only thing we can really do, and it's the only way we can actually get some of our better bonuses when it comes to the economy and the, you know, just war production, essentially. So this is gonna be a bit of a pain because our divisions aren't exactly the best, and we don't have the best the best industry, the best equipment. We don't have a lot of stuff, but we got those naval bonuses. Those are really important. So it's a little bit meh. But you do actually gain a 10% bonus to your attack, which is quite interesting because it serves sort of as a direct equivalent to the Carlists. Plus 5% attack, plus 5% defense, and plus 1% manpower, essentially, which is actually quite powerful because that's a few 100,000. And you could say by the same right that the plus 10% attack is actually quite powerful, because if you have a lot of soft attack, you have a lot of artillery, you have a lot of rocket artillery, you can do a lot of stuff that way. The only issue with that is that your industry can't possibly support all of those things. You have to basically make 7-2s, very basic 7-2s, if you want to sort of stand your ground against the Germans and possibly even do something against them, and you don't want your country to get overrun because of holes within your front line. And that's actually quite an interesting conundrum. You could possibly go with the really elite heavy soft attack divisions, but you're only going to be able to maintain maybe 10, 20 of them. You know, sort of a 40 with extremely soft attack heavy rocket artillery, regular artillery, some regular stuff in there as well. So you don't have to build air, you don't have to build tanks or anything like that, and you only focus on the attack. The issue with that is that they're probably going to be ready in some sort of relatively decent state by 1942 or something, and at that point the Germans have either won or they have lost, and then you're basically left with fighting against the Japanese, which is maybe the intended path for Spain, actually, because you do gain those naval bonuses. So maybe Paradox wanted democratic Spain to fight against the Japanese. But by 1942, again, the Japanese have basically either won in China, and so you're going to be fighting a ground war in China, which is a great decision, and your 40 with divisions are going to be trash when fighting in China, or you're going to have to do a naval invasion of the Japanese home islands. Because of your naval bonuses, you do gain access to some good, to some decent navy stuff. So it's sort of a conundrum. It's sort of like they wanted to give you a lot of bonuses, a lot of varied bonuses, but those bonuses are so varied and they're so linear. You have to take the naval stuff to get the army stuff. You have to take the air stuff to get to the naval stuff and everything like that. It's just so strange, and all the while you still haven't recovered from the Civil War. It's just kind of awkward to play the Democrats. If you want to actually play as the Republicans when it comes to like having fun, and want to go the Democratic side, and you want to recover from the Civil War quickly, it's actually paradoxical that you have to become a puppet of the USSR. And then it's kind of interesting, right? Because when you're a puppet of the USSR, you have the whole independence war thing. You can join the Allies. You can even join the Axis. It's a lot of there are a lot of options, but you first have to become a puppet, and that sort of implies that you have to do terribly within the Civil War. for you to actually then have a little bit more fun later, because what that does is it prolongs the civil war by quite a bit, because you can't focus on defensive so much. You can't get a lot of the good bonuses, you can't get a lot of the good focuses, because you have to focus on on becoming a puppet, getting your economy shattered even further, then possibly having a bit of fun later. It's just not all that great, I don't think. It's just a little bit awkward to really play through it. And ultimately, we're managing to win here, right? Because it's against the Germans, and the entire Allied army is just stacked on my front line, absolutely shattering my supply and everything like that. We're doing some decent damage here, but ultimately it's going to be an insane grind to actually get to Germany. It's, I don't know, it's going to be an interesting war, I think. Okay, so we're actually managing to push into Vichy France quite successfully, but again, we're doing this with the entire Allied force in at our back, which is quite a little bit interesting. It's quite interesting that we can't necessarily do this thing on our own, even though we have that attack and defense bonus. Oh, just attack bonus, really. The attack and defense is with the nationalists. So, you know, the Turkish Empire is fascist, probably because the Republicans won their civil war. Not entirely sure, maybe that's sort of a balancing factor. But I've seen the AI, maybe it's just because of the plethora of mods I'm using actually. The Turkish AI sometimes doesn't really know what it wants to do when it comes to actually choosing some like path or other. For example, if you try to make the Turkish AI reform the Ottomans, they never actually take the right decisions, and they always end up becoming just Democrats till the end of the game. So the Turkish AI sometimes flails about and isn't exactly decisive when it comes to choosing the right ideology. Maybe because the Republicans winning, they went fascist, but I'm not entirely sure. It could be either way. They're actually making some decent progress in Africa and everything like that. But the strange thing about this is that this would have been a whole lot easier and a whole lot quicker and a whole lot more powerful if we actually just went with Franco and just declared war on the fascists. Or on the Axis, more rather. On the Axis, because it's and join the Allies that way. You can have the join the Allies as Franco anyway, and that's probably actually what I'm gonna do. Yeah, I'm gonna showcase what you can do as Franco, and it's much better, much quicker. You do actually get recovery from the Civil War options. You can do whatever. You can take French North Africa. You don't have to take French North Africa, and it's just a whole lot more, let's say, powerful and interesting than the democratic Spain path we're actually going down here. So you can see the war is a complete slog. We're fighting in Africa and everything like that. The Allies are probably the only thing that's keeping us together, actually. It's 1942, right? So it's the war is about to be basically decided on the Eastern Front, but maybe actually because the Turks are fascist, maybe that's sort of the balancing factor. I'm not entirely sure, but we aren't having enough impact within this war at all. The only impact we've actually had is because we were positioned on a certain geographical location. That's the impact that we're making within this war, is that the Allies could use us as a staging ground for their invasion. And that's not necessarily something that I'm comfortable with. You go through this entirely pointless civil war when it comes to actually doing recovery options or grinding your generals to a certain degree. And sure, you grind your generals, but you don't get any bonuses from the path that you chose. So it's pointless to pick the Democrats if you're not actually going to get any bonuses from them when it comes to actual gameplay, apart from role-playing, obviously. But even the role-play options are a little bit miffy because you don't actually get a lot of variety within your focus tree. You can only do the one linear path, which, you know, you have to take air to take the navy to actually do some recovery options, and then you actually don't get the final recovery option until you're at war. And the war focus, the focus that you have to be at war to actually take, is called like preparing for war, which is just, I don't know, it's a very strange. It's like they haven't actually tested it that much, or they just said, you know, whatever, nobody's gonna actually play democratic Spain or something, and that's actually kind of sad because it could have a lot of potential. You could get a lot of economic bonuses. For example, the Francoist path. Actually, yeah, let's forget about this game because this is going terribly and doesn't actually showcase any of the good stuff that you can do as Spain. This is basically the worst path possible, because you get no bonuses. Everything takes so long. We aren't making any progress anywhere, even though the allies are right here, and of course it's the AI. But for example, as the communist path, we would be absolutely thrashing them right now, as the phalanges would be having a lot of fun in America, and everything like that. So yeah, this is basically just nothing. We're just gonna grind our way through to Berlin at this point, and that's all this playthrough is really worth. Just a road to Berlin, and we're gonna completely annihilate our manpower reserves, and our economy isn't going to be better off at all, which ultimately showcases just how terrible the democratic path for Spain is. So let's go to Franco. Okay, so you've seen the Franco Civil War 1,000 times, but this is reason one why Franco is so powerful. Get to just take French North Africa. If you have enough of an army staged on the French border, and you have high enough relations with them, even if you're non-aligned, they just give it to you if you have, well, all of that stuff, and if you're actually quite strong, which is very possible with the Francoist path, because you still gain all the bonuses from the Italians and the Germans, and even to a certain degree the Portuguese giving you aid during the Civil War. You gain essentially weapons or guns research bonuses from the Italians, and artillery bonuses from the Italians, and you get panzer or just tank research speed and aircraft research speed from the Germans. And you also get a lot of Lend-Lease from from the Portuguese, the Germans, and the Italians. So that's a lot of stuff. Then you get to obviously take French North Africa. You get to have Francisco Franco as your country leader. And that's actually quite powerful, because you gain, well, I think he gives more, he makes the generals cheaper, he makes your provinces revoltless often, meaning, you're gonna have a more stable country, and his recovery options after the Civil War are better, his economic bonuses are better. As opposed to the democratic path, obviously, you can just go down autarky and finish the whole Civil War economic debuff within like 5 seconds. It's just absurdly powerful. Then he makes your territories that are colonies and maybe a bit rowdy do less damage to your garrison troops, meaning you have more manpower, more equipment, everything like that. You take less losses from actually governing those provinces, meaning you don't have to have as strict law when it comes to governing those individual provinces. He's just really powerful all around. So no matter what type of a situation you find yourself in, unless you're going communist, the Francoist path is just better. If you want to join the Axis, if you're not comfortable with going with the phalanges because their recovery options aren't as strong, and you don't want to fight a messy civil war, just go with Franco and go fast, take over Portugal, do all the fun stuff in China, maybe even take out the UK. It's pretty simple if you know what you're doing. If you want to go with the Allies, the democratic side, as we saw like 5 seconds ago, it's completely trash. You get no bonuses, it's too linear, it doesn't really do anything for you, it gives you no tangible bonuses for your economy. You can't take over French North Africa, for example. Everything like that, it's weak. Franco is better. If you want to calm your country down after the Civil War, Franco is better. If you want to just create your own faction, Franco is better. It's just insanely strange how much better Franco is than, for example, the democratic side, because the war, we are not even involved in any sort of conflict at all, and yet our economy is booming. Our industry is booming. We're about to get rid of all the debuffs. We just took control of French North Africa. We have a lot more resources. We have better generals, and everything like that. So yeah, Franco is quite decent, and we still get military bonuses. See, that's the one big payoff that you're supposed to have when you're playing as the Democrats, is that you get to join the Allies, which is a very strong faction, obviously, with the United States and everything, and you get to get that 10% attack bonus. Well, with Franco, we get 5% attack bonus, 5% defense bonus, and more population, obviously more manpower, 1% manpower from the Carlism, the fusing of the parties. Essentially, it's quite powerful in and of itself. It's not, maybe you don't get as much attack, but more manpower and more defense is actually quite decent as well. And ultimately, it's the flexibility that really gives Franco all of his power. But I think we have to move on to the actual war to see just how powerful Franco is. Okay, so we're essentially in the same position that we were with the Democrats. We joined the Allies. We are about to attack the Axis. I think we have a little bit more divisions than last time, or at least we are able to sustain them better because our economy is better. Because the Allies actually give you economic bonuses if you're Franco, but they don't give you economic bonuses if you're Democrat, which is kind of strange. It's really not reasonable, I think, just how much the Democrats suck. Definitely in comparison with Franco, I think if there is a Spanish tree that needs to get reworked, it's probably the democratic path, if you're not becoming a puppet of the Soviet Union, because they have no bonuses from actually going with the Democrats. It's or the Allies or the democratic path in general. They just have no bonuses whatsoever. Even the independent communist path, which is sort of you don't necessarily see people using that too often. Even they have more bonuses than the democratic side, which is sort of the big counterbalancing point of Franco, right? But Franco can just do everything better, or much better than the Democrats can do. And we are basically in the same position right here, except we are immediately in an advantage because we already own French North Africa, so we don't have to worry about that front. The war doesn't have to get messy there, and yeah, we have a lot of steel from that territory, and steel is something that you don't have a lot of. You don't have a lot of resources when you're playing as the as Franco, or just Spain in general, more rather, because your territories, well, you do have a lot of tungsten, or at least, you know, a little bit of tungsten, and you do have a little bit of steel. You don't necessarily have anything else, and having access to more steel and more industry from French North Africa is actually quite useful, because you don't have to trade for as much, and obviously you gain more industry from it, and more manpower, and everything like that. So it's actually quite it might not seem as much because, well, it's just French North Africa, right? It's not actually a lot of territory. But for a country that is sort of really struggling to maintain a really decent economy in the early game, it's actually quite powerful, because it does give you a lot of good stuff. And, well, that's basically it. There isn't a single like bad thing about controlling it, except you have to garrison it, and you have to maintain a little bit of control over it when it comes to the rowdiness of the populace. But because Franco basically takes care of that quite often, it's not like it's actually overall that terrible and that difficult. Within the span of, like, let's say in-game a month, they're usually just calm and everything like that. Now obviously within this really narrow front, we're gonna struggle in a very similar fashion to the Democrats, because, well, that's just a given. The Germans aren't becoming less powerful just because we went from Democrat to Franco or anything like that. If anything, they're actually a little bit more powerful, because during the Civil War, well, we gave them a lot of army XP and a lot of air XP and everything like that. And even the Portuguese are actually supporting us. Oh, actually, that's another thing, because we went with Franco, you can do the Iberian Pact, which means that essentially the Portuguese are able to just join you. They can just join you because you went the Iberian Pact. They can just join the Allies right off the bat because you have high relations with them, because you're unaligned. And so if you're going with Fascist Franco, you can just take over the Portuguese and have direct access to their industry. But if you're not doing that, then basically you can just make them join the Allies. It's actually quite basic. And yeah, so that's actually another really powerful thing that you can do as Franco, as opposed to the democratic side of Spain, which yeah, they can't just ask the Portuguese nicely to come over and help. Which, you know, if you're going with the fascists, you can do a very similar thing with Portugal, but it's better to just take over Portugal and be done with it, and just have direct access to all of that tungsten and everything like that. But in this case, the Portuguese are actually supporting us, and I think it's easier to get Portugal on side as the Spanish than it is, for example, as the British. But because you're directly next to them, you have better relations with them, everything like that. The AI just, you know, always agrees to join the Allies. The Axis, you know, sometimes they don't agree. And for example, with the Italian faction, they sometimes don't agree because the Italians are fascists, obviously, and it's not exactly extremely easy to do something like that. But ultimately, that's another powerful thing. You can just ask you can just immediately grab onto Portugal and drag it along with you into the Allies, which, you know, there we go. It's just OP compared to the Democrats, at least, definitely. Okay, so we're making very swift progress because we can maintain the divisions we have better. We have Portugal on side, and we have already dealt with North Africa because it was much easier because we already own French North Africa. Roughly around this same exact period of time, we were stuck within Vichy France and trying to defend it, whereas right now we're actually pushing into the Middle East and pushing into Central Africa, which is now controlled by the Italians. And ultimately, it's just much easier, much swifter. Everything is just easier than the democratic path. We don't have as high attack as with the democratic side, but that's the only thing that those guys have going for them. The Democrats, they only have like 10% increased attack, and they give you a few military factories once you're at war. But you have to be at war to do that, so you have less stability and war support and everything like that. And you have less research speed, because obviously you don't get bonuses from the Italians and the Germans, you know, everything like that. It's so you can immediately see that while during the with the democratic side, or the democratic Spain side, we were just pushing into Vichy France, and the front was essentially stagnating, and North Africa and Africa in general was just a giant mess. And we're nowhere close to the Middle East, and we're nowhere close to Italy. Right now we're actually pushing into Italy, and we're about to surround the entire German army here if we manage to pull off some sort of encirclement right against the Swiss border, and we're managing to actually push across a river against a substantial army. The Soviets are smashing them as well, so immediately you can see a big difference. Not to mention, we're about to finish the Spanish Miracle, which is actually an extremely strong payoff if you go with the Allies. You can obviously rely on the Western democracies, everything like that. You can do your autarky path at the beginning, but you don't have to, obviously. You can just go with the bonuses from joining the Allies when it comes to the economy. They're actually quite strong, as opposed to the 0 bonuses that the democratic side gets. So it's it's just unreasonable, I think, to make the democratic side as weak as it is. So anyway, Franco wins yet again. Well, anyway, Kings, thanks for watching, and see you next time. And don't play democratic Spain.